I'd like to welcome you all to the ISO 9001-2015, an introduction to the world's most popular standard presentation. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for our participants today. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So we ask that you utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be available after we're finished. All of our webinars are recorded. If you'd like to rewatch the webinar with live voiceover, we do put those up on our YouTube page. There's a link for that on our website at www.pgr.com. And if you just want the slides, we make those available as well. Again, if you go to our website and look for webinars, you'll find a link for downloading the slides. Our topics for today, we're going to discuss what is ISO 9001, and we're going to explore what ISO 9001 is by way of what is the scope statement for ISO 9001, and more specifically, how is it structured, how is it worded, because the scope statement is really it's kind of all there. The bits and pieces that make up ISO 9001 are formalized within the scope. So that's how we're going to explore what is ISO 9001. We're going to talk a little bit about where ISO standards come from. We're going to explore the impact of the Annex Sl document. I'll tell you what that is and even where you can review it yourself if you're so inclined. I'm going to walk you through ISO 9001 kind of cover to cover, tell you what's where within the standard. And then I've got a section of this presentation that I call key ideas. And I intend for this to be some plain spoken analysis of what's in the ISO 9001 standard and kind of help you understand what its expectations are. We'll have a couple concluding remarks and then your questions. So what is ISO 9001? Well, its official title is Quality Management Systems Requirement. The intent of the standard is established, as I mentioned, in Section 1, the scope statement. Now, this statement is unchanged in the past 3 editions of ISO 9001. You can go all the way back to the 2000 version of the standard, and this statement is the same. If you jump back even to the earlier versions, to the 1st and 2nd editions, the scope statement is almost entirely unchanged, going all the way back to when ISO 9001 was first published. And here is the scope statement. Here's how it's worded. It says, this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aims to enhance customer satisfaction through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So there's a lot there. So let's break this down and kind of take it piece by piece. To begin with, it starts off with this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system. The opening statement establishes that ISO 9001 is not a product standard. It does not tell anyone how to manufacture or render their product. Any organization that wants to be certified to ISO 9001 still has to define for itself how its product is made, how its service is rendered, what the controls are going to be, and so forth. From there, it says where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. Now, I always like to point out this idea that it includes the words "and services." if you go back to the early years of ISO 9001, the idea was that this was primarily for companies that manufacture tangible products. Well, as we now understand, this standard is a lot more inclusive than that. It covers service-based organizations as well. Now, I don't have it highlighted, but I do want to point out that this statement also has the word consistently. This idea, this theme of consistency is another theme that we're going to see several more times as we work our way through the standard. Next part, that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aim to enhance customer satisfaction. Now, this is probably the central cornerstone of the whole standard. It demands that organizations be attuned, receptive, and responsive to the needs of their customers. We're going to see some terminology that's used. Interested parties. Well, your primary interested party is almost always going to be your customer, and you have to make sure that you are meeting customer requirements. That's a real cornerstone of the standard. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. This is a very important piece of the puzzle here because it acknowledges that this is an ongoing process. Talks about improvement, conformity to requirements, applying the system, not just developing it, but applying it. Improvement is something that we're going to see throughout the standard. And again, you can note that a second time in the scope statement even, we're talking about conforming to customer requirements. That's a huge part of what this standard is built on. Okay. The standards that ISO publishes, ISO is it's a collective, it's a member, it's a group of member bodies. And ISO stands for the International Organization for Standardization. Now, they are based in Geneva, Switzerland, and every standard that they issue is developed by a committee. Now, some of these are developed by technical committees, some of these are developed by advisory committees. ISO 9001 is developed by a technical committee, and it's actually Technical Committee 176. Now, Technical Committee 176 itself has members from each of the major industrialized nations. Obviously, with ISO 9001 being such a big standard, there's a lot of people involved in its development. Now, the US representatives to the TC 176, they come from the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. Now, to get your arms around how ISO 9001 is ordered in terms of clauses and why we put this clause here and this one back here and so forth, it's important that we understand a key document that was actually developed 3 years before ISO 9001 2015 was published, and that's Annex Sl. Annex Sl, at this point, it's been around quite a while. It's actually been out for 9 years now. It's still in some circles referred to as the high-level outline, Annex XL. It is part of a larger ISO publication called ISO IEC Directives Part 1, Consolidated ISO Supplement Procedures Specific to ISO. And unlike most ISO documents, this particular ISO publication is actually available for free. So if you'd ever want to read the standard that is used to develop standards, you can download it from the ISO website at www.iso.org. So Annex Sl was written, as I said, back in 2012, and it was the output of a special committee called the Joint Technical Coordination Group. And what they did at that time was they put together a 10-section blueprint for authoring all of the ISO family of standards. Now, before this effort was undertaken, you could have two ISO standards, one next to the other, and you would have different clause numbering, you would have requirements put in different parts of the standard and so forth. And this made it difficult for organizations that wanted to be able to implement more than one standard. A lot of the companies that are certified out there are not just ISO 9001 certified. They may be ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001, for example, so that they have quality, environmental, and health and safety. So by putting out this standard blueprint, it enforced that you would have all of these sections be the same in terms of numbering. You would have common terms, you'd have core definitions, and so forth. Now at this point, in January 2021, just about every standard that ISO publishes has completed its transition. Now we're still rolling out some. We still have transition deadlines for some that are extending into later this year, but just about all of the ISO family of standards has completed this transition process. So here's an example of how Annex Sl works and how that then transforms into the standard that ISO publishes. So on the left, we have Annex Sl Clause 9.2.1. This one pertains to internal audits. Now you'll note in that opening salvo that the verbiage is exactly the same, with one exception. On the left, we have XXX next to management system. On the right, the actual ISO document, we've inserted the word quality there. If you go down the line, you can see where quality was inserted as needed in subsection 1, subsection B, and then the second clause there, it says the requirements of this international standard. So you can see how Annex Sl provides a framework, a structure for any ISO standard to be built on. Now, Annex Sl has 7 auditable sections. There's 7 sections in the standard that are auditable and for which nonconformances can be issued. And these begin in section 4. Section 4 is entitled Context of the Organization. And there's a number of high-level items here. Things like understanding what you are as an organization, what your context is, who are your interested parties, what is the scope of your system, what are the processes that make up your quality management system. In sections 5 and 6, we have leadership and commitment, and then planning. More high-level stuff going on here, developing your policy statement, defining responsibilities and authorities, defining what your quality objectives are going to be. Your risk assessments are here. And then section 7 is called support. There's actually quite a few things within the support area. We have competency requirements, documented information, what you might call document control. Awareness is here. Calibration is actually here in section 7. So you take sections 4, 5, 6, and 7, you put these together. These are foundation requirements. These are requirements that you build a system on. From there, we go into section 8. And section 8, you can really think of as kind of the day-to-day aspects of an organization and what they do. And they move in a very logical order in section 8. We start out with operational planning, requirements for products, figuring out what you need to know about the product or service that you're going to be issuing, designing that product or service if you happen to be design responsible, working with suppliers, what we now call external providers, controlling the production or service provision. Once all of those other preliminary steps are complete, making sure that those steps that are actual product steps are properly controlled. Releasing your product, releasing your service, making sure it's conforming, and then controlling anything that is non-conforming. Most auditors are going to spend the bulk of their audit time in Section 8, obviously, because that's where the majority of work is actually done on a day-to-day basis. Sections 9 and 10 round out the auditable portion. These are called performance evaluation and improvement. You can think of Section 9 as kind of the checking of the system. We have things like customer satisfaction here, internal audit is found here, management review is found here, and then the improvement clause is kind of a collective of ideas on what we do with that analyzed information. So the corrective action requirement is found here, continual improvement is found here, and so forth. Now that I've walked you through kind of the auditable portion here, what I want to do now is walk you through the standard cover to cover, because there's a lot in here that helps to shape your understanding of the requirements, and it's helpful to kind of have your arms around what's where. So when you crack the book on the standard, it actually begins with section 0.1, part of the introduction section. And 0.1 gives you an overview statement, discusses kind of who the standard benefits, talks about the ideas, the high-level ideas of risk-based thinking, the plan, do, check, act cycle, and it gives you definitions for 4 key terms. Now, this is all taken straight out of Annex Sl. But 3 of these statements are getting official definitions for the first time. Now, the most important of these is shall. Shall statements within the standard, these are things that can be directly audited. These are the areas in which nonconformances can be developed for things. If you're not doing something, if you're not abiding by a shall statement, potentially you might be issued an infraction in an audit for not doing so. And obviously there's all kinds of shall statements in ISO 9001. We also have a definition for should. Now, should is understood as a recommendation. You should do this. You should implement something like this. Now, there's actually no uses of the term should within the auditable content. There's all kinds of uses outside of the auditable content, but nothing within the auditable portion. We also have the term may, which means a permission. It may involve this and so forth, and can. Possibilities, capabilities, all kinds of usages of the word can. The introduction section then continues with section 0.2, the 7 quality management principles. This is actually a reference to the ISO 9000 standard. ISO 9000 is called Fundamentals and Vocabulary. And there's a couple of important things found within ISO 9000, probably none more important than the 7 quality management principles. Now, these are high-level ideas that were developed actually quite a long time ago on the big picture of what ISO 9001 is supposed to be all about, what quality management is supposed to be all about. Now, these ideas actually permeate 9001 itself. You will find each of these concepts rolled into the content of the standard. We've already mentioned customer focus, leadership and engagement of people. Management needs to be involved. Management needs to actually lead. Everyone has a stake within the system. The process approach, we'll actually be exploring that one a little bit later in my presentation. Same with improvement, we'll touch on that a little bit later. Evidence-based decision making, taking action based on actual facts, actual evidence. And then relationship management. This is kind of another way of saying working with your supply base, working with the outside providers, the external providers, and ensuring that their contribution is contributing towards the end goal. The introduction section 0.3 is called process approach. This is a reinforcement of the importance of the process approach. Also gives you an improved graphic. This whole idea of plan, do, check, act. This was a big picture idea that goes back to the 2000 version of ISO 9001. The introduction section continues with risk-based thinking in 033. A further definition of what this term is all about and an explanation of its importance. In 0.4, we have an established relationship with the other management system standards, namely ISO 9000 and ISO 9004, which is the guidance standard on improvement. From there, we go into the numbered sections. Section 1 is scope, as we've looked at earlier. Section 2 is a normative reference statement. And what this normative reference statement does is it establishes a linkage to the ISO 9000 document for all official terms and definitions. Now, the short version of what that means is any definition that appears in ISO 9000 is a binding definition in the context of an audit. Now, this doesn't carry a whole lot of great weight for most terms, but there are a few terms where this has some impact, external provider being a good example of that. Section 3 is terms and definitions. There's actually nothing in there right now. It's kind of a placeholder. All of the terms and definitions so far are satisfactorily addressed by the 9000 document. We've already looked at sections 4 through 10, so let's continue to the back end of the standard and take a look at Annex A. Now, Annex A is an informative portion of the standard. There's actually 8 subsections here. And what this is you can really think of this as counsel, crib notes even, on understanding some of these items that are found within ISO 9001. So for example, in A1, structure and terminology, there's an idea that an organization should feel free to implement a system that is very personal, right down to the terminology that's used. So if you are more comfortable referring to your suppliers as suppliers, you should feel free to continue doing so. You don't have to suddenly start referring to them as external providers just because the standard calls them external providers. Same thing with the numbering. You know, if you choose to have a procedure for purchasing, which a procedure is optional anyhow, but if you happen to have one, you don't have to number it procedure 8.4 just because purchasing ideas appear in section 8.4 of the standard. So that's established in A1. In A2, we have products and services. This is a little bit deeper of a dive into what their intent was in changing all references of product to read products and services. Again, this idea that the standard is very much interested in being inclusive, not just for tangible products, but for service providers. In A3, there's some discussion on interested parties. We get a more full explanation on what they mean by interested parties and how this is going to impact the implementation of the standard. A4 is called risk-based thinking. There's actually some pretty important verbiage here. Again, there's some overview given, but it also comes right out and says you do not have to have a formal structure or process for risk management. So they felt strongly enough about that they wrote it right into the standard. It is not obligatory that you have a risk management process. Never has been. In A5, We have a statement called applicability. Now, for any of you that are on the conference today, if you remember the older versions of ISO 9001, we had terminology in that standard called permissible exclusions. And as you know, that term was retired with the 2015 version of ISO 9001, and it's been replaced with a new concept called non-applicables. A5 rather gives you some clarity on why that was done. In A6, we have documented information. This is a very inclusive phrase, and it actually replaced three phrases that appeared in the older versions of the standard: procedure, record, and document. Now, A6 gives you a little bit of context as to why that was done. In A7, we have organizational knowledge. This is actually, I should say, at the time the standard was published, this was a new concept. So they felt that they should give some explanation on what the requirements were for organizational knowledge, and how organizations are required now to be aware of their competency needs and what their competency needs are going to be down the road, making sure that they're providing for the necessary organizational knowledge. And then finally, Annex A8, control of externally provided products and services. This gives a little bit of context on what that phrase is and who it applies to. It's a very inclusive phrase, covers not just traditional suppliers, but external providers that are going to be things like subcontractors, outsourced labor, things of that nature. The standard then concludes with Annex B, which is a kind of a deep dive on the relationship between ISO 9001 and some other publications, things like ISO 9004, 10001, and so forth, and then a bibliography. Now, there's a lot of content within the standard, and if you're new to reading the standard, it's easy enough to have your eyes kind of glaze over with all of the ISO speak. I think an effort's been made over the years to try to make it a little less ISO speak, or ISOlese as we call it, because they know that there's always going to be folks reading the standard that have never read it before. But nevertheless, it is still a little bit of a strange read for anyone who's never looked at it before. So what I want to do, especially for those of you on the call today that are brand new to ISO 9001, I want to break down what I feel are the 5 core ideas that are found within ISO 9001, the more important fundamental ideas. And those are going to be scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. Now let's start with scope. If you look at section 4.3, the organization that's implementing ISO 9001 is told to develop a scope statement. Now, what is a scope statement? A scope statement represents the extent and the boundaries of your quality management system. It's a statement that says, here is what we are ISO 9001 certified for. So design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripods, distribution of fasteners, plating, heat treating, and sorting of metal stampings. These are all examples of scope statements that tell us what is included in this ISO 9001 certification. Now, ideally, the scope statement that you develop for your system is going to eventually be the same as what is shown on your ISO 9001 2015 certificate that you're going to get from PJR, as close as possible. But you have to understand that you cannot put something in the scope statement that isn't going to be available for audit. So if you have, for example, field installation in your scope statement, you need to understand that PJR has to go and audit the field installation where it's being done. We may have to visit your client and watch you audit you doing your field installation if that is going to be specifically listed on the certificate. If you have purchased new equipment that isn't up and running yet, we can't audit it, obviously, and therefore we can't include that activity within the scope statement. Now, another thing I always like to caution folks about that are new to ISO 9001, be very careful about being too wordy in your scope statement. Consider the following. Let's say that we have an organization that says they want their scope statement to be laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. Now, if you want all of that in the scope statement, our audit has to include laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution, and we have to also ensure that we are looking at flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. And if we're being asked to look at all of that stuff in a single audit, it's possible we're going to have to add time to the audit because we need to make sure that our auditor has enough time to sample all of those areas and show proof in the audit report that each of those items were included in the audit process. That can be very tricky. It can be done, but it can be very tricky. The second key idea within ISO 9001 is the idea of processes. Now, this is another item that comes up fairly early. It's actually first mentioned in section 4.4. And the intent is that you are going to determine what your processes are and how they interface with each other. Now, section 4.4 establishes that a quality management system is made up of processes. Now, this idea of processes is it's a key one. It's an important one. We've actually developed a whole webinar on just this topic. It's called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. So if you are new to the idea of processes, I definitely encourage you to check that webinar out. Now, the idea of processes, it actually cascades throughout the standard. Now, I've got a few of the more important ones here on the screen, but this is not an exhaustive list. We talk about using the process approach in section 511. That's a management or leadership clause. The idea that your quality objectives need to be aligned to your processes. That's mentioned in 6.2.1. Excuse me. The idea that staff have to be competent in all processes. That's mentioned in section 7.1 in a couple places. Making sure that your infrastructure is sufficient for your processes. That's also mentioned in section 7.1. Ensuring that your external processes are controlled. That's mentioned in 8.4. And then reviewing process performance is discussed in 9.3.2 subclause C3. Now, again, these are just a few of the places where processes are mentioned as being the framework by which you conduct an activity. Now, we encourage you to make your processes as personal and unique to what you are as possible. Among other things, this is going to go a long way towards ensuring that your quality management system is adding value to your organization, that you understand it. It's going to help with the buy-in. Think of it that way. If your processes are personal to you, people will understand your system a little bit better, meaning the people that work for you. I definitely encourage you to resist the urge to name your processes after the sections of the standard itself. That might be helpful to an auditor, but it's probably not going to be terribly helpful to you. The third key idea I want to cover is accountability. Now, ISO 9001, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of inclusion of people, it's a very inclusive standard. And it says that it applies to everyone within the scope. Now, this is most directly discussed in section 511. In section 511, it says that the management must make itself accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. Very important basic idea that management leadership is going to be accountable. Now, there's some other places where accountability is discussed. If you look at section 8.6, it says that product release records have to name names. You have to have it on the record who authorized the release of this product for delivery to the customer. Any problems that come up, including customer complaints, these have to be responded to with systemic action. You have to define your roles and responsibilities from section 5.3. And you have to make sure that all personnel are aware of the quality policy and how they contribute to the effectiveness of the quality management system. That's from section 522B and 7.3. Now, the fourth key idea found within ISO 9001 is effectiveness. Now, there's actually a lot of requirements that relate to effectiveness. This whole idea that you should know at any given time how well or how poorly things are going in your operation. This is an idea that's been around for quite a long time. Now, the basic idea of effectiveness measures, it's most directly addressed in section 441C, again, very early on in the auditable portion of the standard. And I've actually pulled the actual verbiage right out of the standard here. It says that you need to determine and apply the criteria and methods, which are going to include monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators. You're going to determine those things that you need to ensure the effective operation and control of processes. So again, it all ties back to what are your processes. So here are some the more direct areas where effectiveness measures are discussed. You have to track your quality objectives, 621. You have to evaluate whether or not people are actually competent, 7.2. You have to evaluate how well or how poorly your external providers are doing, 8.4. You have to evaluate your product performance. You have to inspect your products, 8.6. Customer satisfaction, 912. Trending analysis, 913. Internal audits, a measure of the system at large, 9.2. Reviewing the system in the context of a meeting, 9.3. And then the sum total of your efforts targeting improvement, 10.1. The last key idea that I want to explore today is improvement. Now, improvement is within the current standard. It's actually an evolution of a requirement. If you go back to the 2008 and 2000 versions of the standard, we had an idea in those standards called continual improvement. Now, this current concept of improvement, it actually is built on that, but it acknowledges that there's more to it than just continual improvement. There's going to also be things like reactive changes, breakthroughs, and so forth, not just ongoing improvement. Improvement is a big picture item. Now, primarily improvement is mentioned in section 10.1. And again, I've opted to give you the verbiage right out of the standard here. It says that the organization shall determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement any necessary actions to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. Again, you're seeing some themes here. Making sure that you are meeting customer requirements and enhancing customer satisfaction. Now, again, improvement is a concept that is mentioned in multiple parts of the standard. In 4.4, it says that you have to continually improve your quality management system. In 511, it says that management has to promote improvement. In 521D, it says that your quality policy has to address continual improvement. In 5.3C, it says that your responsibilities that you define have to include reporting on improvement opportunities. In 611D, it says that your risk action efforts need to target improvement. 711 says that resources need to enable you to achieve continual improvement. 7.3 says that people that work for you need to be aware that their efforts impact improvement. And then 932F says that you should be discussing opportunities for improvement when you have your management review meetings. So ISO 9001, it is the world's most utilized standard. There are just over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide. And anyone that's new to ISO 9001 needs to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001 is seeking to promote. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive into ISO 9001 2015, I'd like to invite you to check out our clause by clause course. This is entitled ISO 9001 2015, a clause by clause analysis. This is an online course. It's available for free and it's right on our website. If you go to www.pgr.com, click on training, you'll find the link for it. You can sign up and get started right away. I'd also like to invite you to check out one of our other webinars. We have ISO 9001 2015, Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas. This is a little bit of a dive into what are some of the issues that come up in an ISO 9001 audit and what do we expect in those areas. We have a special presentation just on non-applicable clauses, getting your arms around what can and what can't be excused in an audit assessment. I mentioned our interaction of processes presentation a little bit earlier. We've got webinars on a lot of other things too. We talk about stage 1 auditing, the ISO 1345 standard, the ITF 16949 standard, a whole lot of stuff going on in our webinars. Definitely check out our website and see what might interest you. Now, if you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is, again, go to our website at pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address and click subscribe. You'll be opted in for updates, new webinars, other points of interest automatically. I do thank you for your time today. We're going to go ahead and open the floor for questions. Again, as a reminder, copies of today's presentation will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, it will be posted to our YouTube page a little bit later today. So you'll be able to check that out if you want to rewatch with voiceover. Any other questions today? Okay, we have a rather lengthy question here. Just a moment. Okay, Angel Simontal, you're asking about packaging equipment that needs to be sent for outside calibration. That is absolutely an ISO 17025 question. If you want to transpose that and send it to one of our team members at Perry Johnson Laboratories, they can potentially help you with that. Any other questions today? Okay, all of you have a great day. Stay safe. Thank you for your time.